It was early January 1943, and the skies above England were painted with a grim shade of gray, the kind that seemed to weigh down the world itself. The wind whipped through the airfields, carrying with it the bitter cold of a harsh winter. Beneath the low, threatening clouds, the ground was slick with frost, and the fog hung heavy, swallowing up the edges of the landscape. The airmen, those young men far from home, had become used to the unrelenting chill. They had learned how to manage the cold that gnawed at their bones, the way the oxygen masks fogged up on every breath, the way their hands shook with the sharpness of it all. But today it felt different. There was something in the air, something about the stillness of the morning that made the usual hum of engines feel more like a prelude to something bigger. In the barracks, the pilots adjusted their flight suits, checked their gear, and prepared for what was supposed to be just another routine mission. The routine was always the same: briefing, takeoff, escort the bombers over enemy territory, and then make the return trip to England. It was a cycle they had come to know too well. But for one pilot, this mission felt different. He had seen the reports, heard the whispers around the airfield, how the Germans had adapted, how their tactics had become more deadly. The loss rates were climbing, and every day seemed like it could be the one where everything changed. James Howard sat alone in his cramped cockpit, his breath steady as he checked his instruments. He wasn't one for small talk or unnecessary chatter. His fellow pilots often joked that he was more a thinker than a talker, a man who kept his thoughts close to the chest. At 30, he was older than most of the men around him, a veteran among rookies. He had already flown in the Pacific with the Flying Tigers, had seen more than his fair share of combat, and learned that survival often hinged not on firepower, but on how well you could think in the chaos of the moment. He'd seen death too many times to be naive about the nature of war. Today, he knew it wasn't going to be just another day in the sky. The briefing was brief, as it always was, targeting a German industrial complex deep within occupied Europe. The bombers, a convoy of B-17 flying fortresses, would rely on their fighter escorts to ensure their safe passage. The P-51 Mustangs, Howard's plane, were to protect the bombers as they made their way across the English Channel and into the heart of enemy territory. The plan seemed simple enough, as it always did, but beneath the surface, something was off. Howard couldn't shake the feeling that this mission wasn't going to end the way they all expected. He had heard the rumors. The Germans were refining their tactics, perfecting the head-on attacks that had already claimed the lives of so many bomber crews. The engines roared to life as the Mustangs and B-17s lined up for takeoff. Howard's eyes scanned the skies, watching the familiar sight of the bombers gathering into formation. There was something about the way the bombers lined up, so perfectly, so predictably, that made him uneasy. The Germans, he knew, would be watching. They would be waiting, prepared to strike. He had been in combat long enough to know that the enemy's next move was always the most dangerous. As the planes climbed into the frigid air, the morning fog began to thin, revealing the barren landscape below. England's countryside stretched out beneath them, its patchwork quilt of fields and small towns disappearing into the horizon. The radio crackled with the usual chatter, pilots coordinating their movements, checking in with one another. It was all routine, and yet Howard couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was going to happen today. Something he couldn't quite predict, but something that would demand every ounce of his experience and instinct. The bombers ahead of him maintained their steady pace, a symbol of American might and precision. The B-17s were the heart of the American bombing campaign, the backbone of the 8th Air Force's strategy to cripple Germany's war machine. But as much as they were built for durability, they were not invincible. Howard knew the risks all too well. The Luftwaffe had learned how to tear into these formations with ruthless efficiency and terrifying precision. The head-on attack, their signature move, was a calculated nightmare for the gunners of the bombers. And once the fighters closed in, there was little they could do to defend themselves. Howard focused on the skies around him, scanning for any sign of movement. The wind tugged at his plane, the cold creeping through the seams of his flight suit, but he barely noticed. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating, preparing. He had seen enough combat to know that the only thing that truly mattered in the air was timing, and today he had a sense that timing would be everything. The Germans would come, and when they did, he would be ready. And so, as the flight continued, the air grew heavier. The buzz of the radio chatter intensified, and the silence of the cold skies was pierced by the distant roar of enemy engines. In the quiet moments before the storm, Howard's mind was clear. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. What was about to come would be unlike anything any of them had experienced before. Today, the rules of the sky would be rewritten, and one pilot would make a decision that would change everything. The mission had started as any other, but now the sky was thick with tension. The B-17 bombers, massive and slow, flew in tight formation, their engines droning steadily against the biting wind. Each bomber, a giant in its own right, was a fortress of metal, but even fortresses could fall. Howard kept his Mustang close, scanning the horizon, his mind working in sync with the hum of his engine. The B-17s relied on him and his fellow P-51 pilots to keep them safe, but in this theater of war, safety was a fleeting illusion. The radio crackled with routine updates, location coordinates, airspeed adjustments, occasional weather reports, but all the while, Howard's senses were heightened, every muscle taut with expectation. The Germans were coming. It wasn't a question of if, but when. The Luftwaffe had already proven their efficiency, ruthlessly cutting into bomber formations with speed and precision. The head-on attack had become their signature maneuver, a brutal tactic that left little time for gunners to react. The B-17s were equipped with multiple .50 caliber machine guns, but no matter how many gunners lined the fuselage, there were simply too many directions from which to be attacked. As Howard's Mustang flew just above the formation of B-17s, his eyes swept across the formations of bombers and the empty sky surrounding them. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful, but that peace was deceptive. In the distance, the first dark silhouettes appeared. German fighters, perhaps a dozen, perhaps more, climbing from the depths of the gray cloud bank, their engines barely audible, growing louder with every passing second. Howard's heart rate increased, though his outward demeanor never changed. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. The bomber crews didn't know it yet, but the storm was coming. For the men inside the B-17s, their world was contained within the confines of their bomber. They couldn't see the approaching threat until it was nearly too late. Their gunners, each man trained to protect the aircraft, peered through their sights, adjusting for altitude and speed, knowing that once the fighters arrived, they'd have precious seconds, maybe a minute, to respond. They couldn't see what Howard saw, the German fighters forming up, closing in with the speed of a freight train, their guns aimed and ready. Howard's mind was already calculating the angles, the distances. He knew the Germans would come in fast and hard, targeting the weakest link in the formation. The B-17s, despite their heavy armament, had no forward-facing guns to protect them from a head-on assault. That's where he came in. The Mustang's reputation as a formidable fighter wasn't just based on its firepower. It was the precision, the ability to outmaneuver, to adjust in real time, to shift the battlefield in ways the enemy didn't expect. He could already hear the buzz of the German fighters on the radio, their chatter faint but growing in intensity. Then, like clockwork, they came Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the sleek, deadly machines cutting through the air with surgical precision. Joined by the roar of the Focke-Wulf 190s, the Luftwaffe's answer to the P-51 Mustang. Their speed was incredible, their tactics honed through years of combat. They came in waves, spreading across the sky, forming tight, calculated groups as they closed the gap. The B-17s, now vulnerable, couldn't break formation. If they did, the airspeed and turbulence would scatter them, making them an easier target. The tension in Howard's cockpit was palpable. He adjusted his throttle, prepared his weapons, and glanced at the formation ahead. The German fighters were gaining altitude, positioning themselves for the strike. They were moving fast, faster than Howard had anticipated. He knew it wouldn't be long now before the bombers would be in their sights, and with no time to waste, he had to make a choice. In the space of a few seconds, the first volley of enemy aircraft broke through the cloud cover, their shadows streaking across the bomber formation like predators closing in on their prey. The B-17s tightened up, the crew bracing for impact, and the radio came to life with frantic calls from the gunners, warning of incoming enemy fighters. Howard's eyes were locked on the attacking formation, and for a brief moment, everything around him faded into a blur. His focus was razor-sharp, his senses alive with the awareness that in this moment, everything was on the line. The bomber crews had done their part. Now it was up to him. Howard knew the Germans would come in low, fast, and deadly. They would target the bombers with brutal efficiency, aiming for the weakest link in the chain. But this time, Howard was ready to break the chain. This time, he would make the impossible decision. The decision that would defy every rule in the book and change the course of the battle. James Howard was not the typical image of a fighter pilot. He wasn't brash, he didn't seek attention, and he didn't fit the mold of the young, cocky aces who surrounded him. At 30, he was older than most of the men in his squadron, a quiet, methodical figure among the youthful, wide-eyed pilots. While the others reveled in the thrill of combat, Howard rarely spoke about the battles he had fought, the enemies he had killed. He didn't need to. His focus was always on the mission, not the accolades. He understood the nature of war, not as a game, but as a constant, relentless test of survival. Born in 1913 in Canton, China, to missionary parents, Howard had spent much of his childhood in a land far removed from the bustling cities and comforts of home. He grew up watching his parents navigate a world of uncertainty, solving problems with limited resources and little support. It was this environment that shaped him into the man he would become. Someone who thrived under pressure, who could think his way through impossible situations, and who never relied on chance. In 1937, Howard left school at Pomona College, where he had been studying pre-med, and joined the Navy as an aviation cadet. His aspirations to become a pilot were strong, but a minor medical disqualification kept him grounded. Most men would have let that setback end their dreams. Not Howard. He went to China, joining the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, just months before Pearl Harbor. There, flying the rugged P-40 Warhawk, Howard found his true calling. In the jungles of Burma and southern China, he fought against the Japanese with limited resources, no reinforcements, and often no idea if help would ever come. The Flying Tigers, though outnumbered and outgunned, had one advantage. Their pilots were taught to think on their feet, to exploit every weakness, to never fight fair. Howard excelled in this environment. He learned to turn the P-40's strengths, its dive speed, its ruggedness, its ability to absorb punishment, into lethal weapons. He adapted, using the sun, the clouds, and the terrain to his advantage. He understood how to read the battlefield in ways that others didn't, and it didn't take long for him to rack up confirmed kills, becoming one of the AVG's most reliable pilots. But Howard wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was a man who studied his environment. He didn't seek glory or fame. Instead, he was focused on getting the job done. He had a quiet confidence, built not on bravado but on an inner understanding of the odds stacked against him. It was this mindset that made him an unlikely fit for the 8th Air Force's mission in 1943. When the Flying Tigers disbanded and Howard returned to the U.S., he joined the Army Air Forces, expecting to be sent to the Pacific Theater. But instead, he was assigned to England, where the newly formed 355th Fighter Group flew P-51 Mustangs, the aircraft that would eventually become legendary for its range and firepower. At first, Howard's squadron mates didn't quite know what to make of him. He didn't drink heavily, didn't chase thrills like the others. While the younger pilots talked of their dreams and ambitions, Howard was quiet, watching, analyzing. He didn't boast or show off. He was a man who observed the big picture, looking for patterns, studying the enemy, and preparing for the unpredictable. His calm demeanor set him apart, making him seem almost distant from the youthful energy of his fellow pilots. But what they didn't realize was that this quiet composure was exactly what made him so dangerous. Howard wasn't flying just to survive. He was flying to solve the puzzle in real time, to outthink his opponents, and to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. He was also a man who understood the nature of risk. His calmness wasn't the absence of fear. It was the recognition that fear alone could not be allowed to dictate his actions. Where others might have panicked, Howard would act. Where others would freeze, he would calculate. His ability to think under pressure was honed by years of flying in the most chaotic of environments, and it was that experience that would prove invaluable in the coming hours. When Howard was assigned to escort a B-17 formation on January 11, 1944, deep into enemy territory, he knew that this mission would be different. It wasn't just about shooting down enemy fighters or protecting the bombers, it was about survival. The mission to Germany was a maximum range sortie, and the B-17s would need every ounce of protection they could get. The Luftwaffe had been adapting, becoming more lethal. German fighter tactics had evolved, and the head-on attacks in particular were proving devastating for the bombers. Howard's squadron would be outnumbered, and his fighter escorts were limited. There was no room for error. As the planes climbed into the cold, gray sky, Howard's mind was already working, already preparing for the worst. This was no ordinary mission. He had flown enough combat missions to know that things rarely went according to plan. The Germans were watching, waiting, and when they struck, they would strike fast. But Howard didn't worry about what could happen. Instead, he focused on what would happen and how he would be the one to turn the tide. He wasn't just a fighter pilot. He wasn't just a man of action. He was a man who understood that in war, everything could change in an instant. Today, he would face the storm. And, as always, he would face it with the calm resolve of a man who knew that in the end, it was the mind that won battles, not the bravado. The sky had been deceptively quiet for a few minutes, but Howard knew better than to trust the silence. The Germans were out there, circling like vultures, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The formation of B-17s ahead of him pressed on, their engines droning in unison, a steady hum that betrayed no sign of the danger lurking behind them. The weight of the mission was palpable, hanging in the air like the frigid mist. Howard's eyes flicked between his instruments and the horizon, scanning for any sign of the enemy. Then, as if on cue, the first flashes of enemy fighters appeared at the edges of the formation. They were coming fast, climbing out of the clouds like phantoms, their engines roaring as they closed the distance. The Luftwaffe's attack was swift and precise, just as Howard had feared. German fighters, in perfect formation, swooped down with terrifying speed. The B-17s had no way of defending against a head-on assault, and the bombers, locked in their tight formations, were vulnerable. Howard's pulse quickened as he checked his fuel gauge. Only enough for a few more minutes of combat. He glanced at the bomber formation, where the gunners were already tracking the oncoming attack. But it wasn't enough. The B-17s were sitting ducks, unable to react to the fighters fast enough. The bombers needed protection, immediate protection, and Howard was the only one close enough to help. But the choice that lay before him was no simple one. His own flight of P-51s, spread across the sky like a protective web, was already engaged with a group of German fighters. Howard had seen the flashes of gunfire and the telltale trails of smoke in the distance. They were outnumbered, and the clock was ticking. He could follow his flight back to the relative safety of their formation, leaving the bombers behind to fend for themselves. Or he could break off, head directly into the storm, and engage the Germans alone. The pressure mounted with every passing second. His squadron was struggling to stay on course, torn between defending the bombers and fighting off the German fighters. Howard's radio crackled with reports of enemy positions, of dogfights erupting across the sky. But it all felt distant now, noise, static, disjointed from the real decision at hand. The bombers ahead of him were about to face their worst nightmare, and Howard knew that if he turned back now, if he followed the others, those bombers would be lost. His mind raced, calculating the odds, but it wasn't just numbers that weighed on him. It was something more, something that came from his years of experience, his time in the skies over Burma and China, fighting the Japanese. He had seen this before, the moment when the odds were too great, when the choice to act or not would define everything. His training had taught him to always move, always adapt, but never at the expense of the mission. The bombers needed him. Howard shoved the throttle forward. The Mustang roared to life, surging ahead with a power that felt more like instinct than choice. He didn't glance back to check on his flight. There was no time for that. The bombers were vulnerable, and if he hesitated even for a second, it would be too late. Alone now, Howard hurtled into the heart of the danger, his mind focused on one thing: protecting the bombers. The German fighters had not yet committed to their attack. They were still adjusting their positions, circling, preparing for the perfect moment to strike. Howard's Mustang cut through the sky, closing the gap faster than they could anticipate. He had one advantage: surprise. They had not expected a lone fighter to come charging at them with this kind of determination, with the full force of a man who had nothing to lose. As the German fighters split off, preparing to dive, Howard felt the weight of the decision settle in his chest. There was no backup, no plan beyond the immediate fight ahead. Just him, his plane, and the bombers he had sworn to protect. Every move now would count. Every decision would tip the balance. The Germans were closing in, and Howard knew he had only moments to make a difference. His Mustang, moving with the speed and grace of a predator, was his only weapon, and he was ready to use it. No turning back, no second thoughts. In the split second that followed, Howard was already locking on to the first of the German fighters, the rest of the chaos fading into the background as his world narrowed to a single objective: defend the bombers or die trying. Howard's Mustang screamed through the air, its engine growling under the strain as he closed in on the German fighters. The world outside his cockpit was a blur of steel, smoke, and fire. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was still calculating, still weighing the consequences. The bomber formation was ahead, the B-17s locked in their vulnerable positions, and the German fighters were drawing closer by the second. In a matter of moments, the attack would begin, and Howard would be the only one between the bombers and certain destruction. His mind flashed through 1,000 scenarios. He could turn back, rejoin his flight, and leave the bombers to their fate. The risk was too great, the odds stacked too high. But something in him, something deeper than calculation or instinct, refused to even entertain that thought. The B-17 crews were counting on him, and he knew that if he turned away now, he would never be able to live with the decision. This was the moment that defined a man, that defined a pilot. This was a choice no manual, no doctrine, no training had prepared him for. There was no rule to follow, no precedent to guide him. His fuel gauge flickered, a cruel reminder that time was not on his side. He had just enough fuel to make the attack and maybe, just maybe, return to base. But even that was uncertain. His ammo was low, and he was already pushing the limits of his Mustang's capabilities. Each minute spent in the sky, each second spent diving into combat, burned through his fuel faster than he could replenish it. He could not afford to waste time, and yet the pressure of every passing moment weighed on him. The longer he stayed in the fight, the more likely it was that he wouldn't have enough fuel to make it home. But the bombers, those lumbering giants, had no chance without him. They were sitting ducks, locked in formation, unable to break free and defend themselves from the German fighters closing in. The B-17 gunners would fire their weapons with all their might, but they were not enough. The Germans would find a way in. It was a matter of when, not if. Howard knew that if he didn't act, the mission would be a failure, and the cost would be counted in the lives of the men flying those bombers. As the first group of German fighters dove from the sky, Howard's hands tightened on the controls. His heart hammered, but his mind was sharp, laser-focused. The choice was before him, laid out with brutal clarity. Abandon the bombers and return to safety, or risk it all and fight, knowing that the odds were impossibly stacked against him. He took a breath, steadying himself. He was alone now, no backup, no reinforcements, just him and his plane against the enemy. The German fighters were fast, and there were far more of them than there were of him. Outnumbered, outgunned. And yet, in his gut, he knew the truth. Turning back wasn't an option. The cost of survival was too high. The bombers would be lost, and he would live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. Howard shoved the throttle forward, pushing the Mustang to its limits. The air howled around him, and the world became a blur of motion and sound. Every sense was on high alert, his mind calculating angles, adjusting for the unpredictable chaos unfolding before him. His fuel was running low, his ammunition was dwindling, But the one thing he had left was the element of surprise. The Germans hadn't expected him to charge at them head-on. They hadn't anticipated a lone fighter coming at them, a single man standing between them and their targets. But Howard wasn't fighting just to survive. He was fighting for something more, something deeper than any tactical advantage. He was fighting for the men in those bombers, for their families, for their chance to make it home. There was no manual for this, no doctrine to follow, no textbook answers, just a pilot in the heat of battle making a choice that would define him forever. The Germans were coming, but Howard wasn't backing down. With a final glance at the bomber formation, he adjusted his course, lining up on the first enemy fighter, and prepared to dive into the chaos. It was now or never. There was no turning back. Howard's Mustang surged forward, cutting through the sky with an intensity that made every second feel like a lifetime. The German fighters were now within range, their engines howling as they closed in on the B-17s. In the distance, Howard could see them, the Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, deadly, and moving with ruthless precision. They had no idea what was about to hit them. As Howard dove toward them, the sky seemed to tilt, the ground blurring beneath him as he focused solely on the enemy fighters. His hands tightened on the controls, his mind moving in fluid calculations as he adjusted his speed and trajectory. The Germans, accustomed to their well-practiced head-on attacks, had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. But Howard wasn't following their script. He had one advantage: surprise. The Germans came in, their engines roaring as they dove straight at the formation, aiming for the B-17s. But Howard didn't hesitate. With a flick of the stick, he positioned himself directly in the path of the oncoming fighters. He could hear the snap of the wind and the roar of his Mustang's engine as he accelerated into the heart of the oncoming storm. The first German fighter broke through the cloud cover, diving straight toward the bombers. Howard lined up his sights, his heart racing but his hands steady. The German pilot was committed, locked into his trajectory, focused on the target ahead. But Howard had a different plan. He didn't go for the easy kill. Instead, he forced the German into a position that no one had ever expected. At the last possible moment, Howard pulled hard on the stick, snapping his Mustang into a hard right turn. The enemy fighter, locked onto its target, couldn't adjust in time. The German pilot saw the Mustang flash in front of him, and in that split second of confusion, Howard fired a burst of tracers that sliced through the air. The enemy fighter broke off, trailing smoke, unable to recover from the sudden change in the battlefield. But Howard wasn't finished. The Germans didn't back down easily. They quickly regrouped, their formations shifting as they prepared to make another run. Howard's Mustang, now in the thick of it, had disrupted their rhythm. The Germans were no longer able to line up their attack with the precision they were used to. They were on the defensive, reacting to Howard's every move, trying to anticipate what he would do next. The skies exploded with gunfire as Howard danced through the chaos. He maneuvered with a calm that belied the danger surrounding him, using the natural flow of the dogfight to his advantage. The Germans had expected an easy kill, but now they were the ones on the back foot, forced to adjust to an enemy who was rewriting the rules of aerial combat. The rhythm of the fight had shifted, and the Germans didn't know how to react. Howard had thrown their carefully crafted strategy into disarray. He wasn't fighting like a conventional escort. He wasn't playing by the rules. And that, above all else, was what made him so dangerous. The German fighters, so accustomed to their efficient head-on strikes, found themselves in a battle they hadn't anticipated. Howard's tactics weren't about aggression or sheer force, they were about positioning. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that air combat wasn't just about firepower. It was about geometry, timing, and making the enemy adjust to you. As the Germans tried to reform and regroup, Howard stayed close, just within striking distance, but never too close to be predictable. His Mustang slid through the air like a predator, always one step ahead, always in the right place at the right time. Every time a German fighter tried to position itself for a clean shot at the bombers, Howard was there, disrupting their approach, forcing them into awkward angles that left them vulnerable. His moves were calculated, deliberate, and precise. One by one, the German pilots tried to adjust, switching up their tactics. Some attempted high-speed passes from above, trying to catch Howard off guard. Others tried flanking maneuvers, hoping to trap him in a pincer movement. But Howard was always there, anticipating their next move, responding faster than they could adjust. He forced them into positions they were not used to, too close, too risky, with no clear shot. As the battle raged on, the Germans began to hesitate. They weren't sure how to deal with a fighter that was willing to break all the rules, a fighter who had no fear of engaging them directly, even at close range. Howard's presence alone was enough to cause confusion, disrupting their focus and making them second-guess every decision. The odds were still heavily against him. He was outnumbered, low on fuel, and with limited ammunition. But Howard's calm, methodical approach had turned the tide of the fight. The German fighters, once so confident in their attack runs, were now on the defensive. They were forced to change their strategy with each pass, never quite able to land the killing blow they had so carefully planned. Howard was the wrench in their machine, the unknown factor that had thrown their entire strategy into disarray. For a moment, the air seemed to still. The German fighters, having failed to break the formation, began to peel away, regrouping for another assault. But now the psychological edge had shifted. Howard had done more than just protect the bombers. He had exposed a weakness in the Germans' tactics. The head-on attack, once the signature of their offensive, had been disrupted by a single fighter pilot who was willing to break the rules. As the Germans circled back for another attempt, Howard tightened his grip on the controls. He wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The battle had only just begun, and Howard had proven something that would haunt the Luftwaffe for the rest of the war. One man, alone in the sky, could turn everything upside down. What if everything we knew about air combat was wrong? What if the best defense was to break all the rules? Howard had always followed the rules of engagement, well, the ones that made sense. But today, in the heat of battle, everything he had been taught seemed to fall away. The head-on attacks from the German fighters were relentless, brutal, and nearly impossible to stop. The bombers were helpless, their gunners firing blindly into the chaos. But there was only so much they could do. They needed something more, someone who was willing to sacrifice everything to protect them. Without hesitation, Howard made a decision that no fighter pilot had ever made before. Instead of staying on the outside of the bomber formation like he was trained to, he dove in straight into the heart of the B-17s. It was unthinkable. Fighters had always been instructed to stay clear of the bombers, to protect them from the outside and intercept the Germans before they could strike. But Howard saw something others didn't. He understood that the German attackers needed a clear path, an unobstructed shot at the bombers, and if he could get between them and their targets, he could disrupt the attack long enough for the bombers to survive. As Howard's Mustang sliced through the formation, the bombers' gunners, who had been struggling to keep up with the incoming fighters, suddenly had a new ally. They saw him not as an enemy, but as part of the team. It was a fleeting, unspoken understanding. Howard would shield them, and they would watch his back. The bombers' gunners adjusted their fire, holding their shots when he maneuvered, giving him space to work his magic. The Germans, closing in fast, didn't know what hit them. Instead of attacking the bombers head-on, they had to choose. Engage the Mustang that had wedged itself into the formation, or break off and risk colliding with the bombers. They hesitated, not used to the unpredictability of a fighter inside the formation. Howard, with precision and calm, maneuvered to stay between the German attackers and the bombers, turning the tables on their well-practiced strategy. What had once been a carefully orchestrated attack by the Germans was now in chaos. Howard's presence alone forced the Luftwaffe to rethink their tactics. He wasn't just flying with the bombers. He was becoming part of the formation, a living, breathing barrier that stopped the Germans in their tracks. The bombers' gunners adjusted their sights, their shots becoming more accurate, and for the first time, the formation felt protected, unified in a way they had never been before. Fuel running low, ammunition spent, and enemy fighters closing in again. Would this be the end for Howard and the bombers? The sky had turned into a battlefield, a wild, chaotic dance of metal and fire. Howard's Mustang was a blur of motion, always shifting, always adjusting to the ever-changing fight. His body ached from the G-forces, his hands numb from gripping the controls. His fuel gauge was dangerously low, and his ammunition was nearly spent. But none of that mattered. Not now. The German fighters were relentless, coming at him from all angles. Their numbers were overwhelming. Howard had already disrupted several attacks, but now they were regrouping, pressing harder, pushing him to his limits. His Mustang, once sleek and fast, was beginning to feel sluggish. His engine sputtered as he pushed it past its breaking point, coaxing every last ounce of power from it. The toll of the fight was evident. His plane had been hit, the fuselage riddled with bullet holes, the engine running hot. His vision was narrowing, the edges of his consciousness growing fuzzy as the lack of oxygen and adrenaline set in. But Howard couldn't stop. The bombers, still vulnerable, depended on him. If he gave up now, if he turned back, they wouldn't make it. The Germans would tear through the formation, and the price would be paid in lives. So Howard pressed on, forcing his Mustang into yet another engagement, turning his plane in tight, controlled loops, using every trick he knew to keep the enemy from locking onto the bombers. Each pass he made, each move he executed was a gamble. His fuel was all but gone, and he knew he wouldn't make it back if the fight dragged on much longer. But in the chaos, in the frenzied dance of aerial combat, Howard's mind was calm. He wasn't thinking about his own survival. He was thinking about the mission, about the men in the bombers, about the incredible odds they were up against. In this moment, there was no plan beyond survival. There was only action, and Howard would fight until his plane could no longer carry him. When the dust settled, one pilot's actions had altered the course of the war, and no one could say it was by chance. The battle was over, and the skies above the German border were quiet once more. The German fighters had broken off, their numbers thinning as they realized the odds were no longer in their favor. Howard, though battered and broken, had seen the enemy retreat into the clouds. The bombers, battered but intact, were making their way back to England, their mission complete. Howard's fuel had run dry, his Mustang limping on fumes as he maneuvered it toward friendly territory. He had done the impossible. He had turned the tide of the battle not with sheer firepower but with a mind that saw a solution where others saw only hopelessness. His actions had saved the bombers, and in doing so had shifted the trajectory of the war. Back at base, the bomber crews recounted their miraculous survival. They spoke of the lone Mustang that had stayed with them, that had become their shield in the sky, a pilot who had risked everything without hesitation. The squadron commanders, who had followed the doctrine of fighter escort with calculated precision, were left speechless by what Howard had done. His actions, unconventional and reckless as they seemed, had proven the tactical brilliance of breaking the rules. Howard had redefined what it meant to protect a formation, and his legacy would ripple through air combat doctrine for years to come. He didn't seek fame. He didn't care for recognition. But his legacy would live on in the skies for decades. James Howard never sought the spotlight. He didn't need medals or accolades to know that he had done the right thing. The Medal of Honor came in 1944, recognizing his extraordinary courage and selflessness, but Howard accepted it without fanfare, without a desire for personal glory. He did what needed to be done, and that was enough. After the war, Howard returned to civilian life, a man who had changed the course of history without ever intending to. He spent the rest of his years in Florida, far from the limelight, rarely speaking of his heroism. His story, though, became the stuff of legend in the aviation world. His tactics, his understanding of geometry and timing, his willingness to sacrifice, these would become the cornerstones of future air combat doctrine. Howard's legacy wasn't just about the one mission he had flown. It was about the mindset he had cultivated, the recognition that in war, the most profound victories often come from the quiet, decisive moments that defy expectations. His actions on January 11, 1944, changed the way fighter pilots would operate for the rest of the war. And in the years that followed, Howard's quiet heroism would inspire generations of pilots to come. James Howard passed away in 1995, leaving behind a legacy that no medal could fully capture. He was a man who had rewritten the rules of war in the skies, and though he never sought recognition, his story lived on, a testament to the power of clarity, courage, and the ability to break the rules when the situation demanded it.